title of the talk, you know, surfaces. It's just too difficult to say secretary in English for me, so I chose maid. But you'll see, you know, these are actually very similar in terms of what they get across. Okay, so items were presented in isolation. All our items were presented in isolation because this is one of the conditions for non-literal default interpretations. And participants were asked to decide whether context-less negatives and their affirmative counterparts have either a literal interpretation or a metaphoric interpretation. Results showed that the mean probability to be judged as figurative was higher for the negative than for the affirmative items. Okay, so now that we have established, you know, the role of negation in inducing metaphoricity, we wanted to see whether this is peculiar to or unique to negation, or whether, you know, any other operator could do the job. So we decided to compare a negation marker, not, with an affirmative marker, like almost day in Hebrew. And, well, we still predicted that items featuring a negative modifier will be rated as more metaphoric than items featuring an affirmative, than items featuring an affirmative modifier such as almost. Well, this time we engaged 24 students of Tel Aviv University, all speakers of Hebrew. And we presented the items differently. We didn't want them to, you know, be forced to decide whether it's either literal or metaphoric. We wanted to allow them some freedom, and therefore they were allowed to rate the degree of metaphoricity. So items such as the "you're not my maid" were followed by a scale. Actually, it was a 7-point scale, but the numbers weren't made explicit. And we and this scale featured a metaphoric interpretation at one end, like "don't serve me" on the right of the scale, and a literal interpretation on the other side of the scale. "You're not the person who cleans my place for a living." Now, of course, it was the interpretations were randomly presented at either side, but I'm going to always show you the metaphoric interpretation on the right and the literal interpretation on the left. Okay. There were also presented affirmative counterparts involving the affirmative modifier. Okay, "you're almost my maid." On the right, you can read the metaphoric interpretation. "You helped me a lot with the housekeeping chores." And on the left, the literal interpretation, "you're about to get the job as a maid in my place." Okay. Participants were asked to rate on a 7-point scale the proximity of the interpretation of the item to any of those instantiations at the scale's end. Well, results showed again that negative statements were rated as more metaphoric than their affirmative counterparts. Okay. What we have done so far is to actually select items that met 3 of the conditions of novel literal interpretation being derived or induced by default. But we haven't controlled for familiarity. We actually assume that these items are not familiar, but we haven't tested that. So in experiment 3 and 4, we also added this variable. We controlled for familiarity, and we compared novel negatives with novel affirmatives. Okay. So to test the claim that some novel negative utterances are interpreted non-literally by default, one has to show that first, For example, they are rated as non-literal compared to their affirmative counterparts when presented in isolation, and that they are read faster in a metaphorically than in a literally biasing context. So this is a rather daring attempt showing that novel metaphors are read faster than equally novel literal expressions. I mean, I was really kind of scared. Anyway, in experiment 3, we first rated novel negatives and novel affirmatives. And again, we predicted that novel negative items will be rated as more metaphoric than the equally novel affirmative counterparts. Of course, we had to run a novelty, or rather a familiarity pretest. And indeed, the experimental items were selected on the basis of the results of the familiarity pretest. The selected negative and affirmative versions were equally novel, scoring below 4 on a 7-point familiarity scale. Items were presented as before, followed by scale. This is not Memorial Day. On the right, you have the metaphoric interpretation, no need to be so sad. On the left, you have the literal interpretation. We are not celebrating Memorial Day today. Well, the affirmative versions were presented in the same manner. On the right, you have the metaphoric interpretation. If it reads, this is Memorial Day, everybody is sad. On the left, you have the literal interpretation. We are celebrating Memorial Day today. Results showed, as predicted, that novel negatives were rated as more metaphoric than their novel affirmative counterparts. Okay, experiment 4 was the reading times experiment, and it included only negative items. No affirmative items, only negative items, only novel negatives. And again, we predicted that novel negative utterances will be read faster when embedded in a metaphorically biasing context than in a literally biasing context. Sorry. Sure. Okay, so we constructed context. These are actually abridged versions of the original context. I just wanted both the literal context and the metaphoric context to be displayed on one screen. So I'll read the context to you. The first one is the literally biasing context. When Danny arrived at school, he was surprised to find everybody dressed in white shirts. He tried to figure out the reason. Well, it's not the eve of any holiday, as far as I can remember, and this is not a Friday either, so what else could it be? Let me think. This is not Memorial Day. Geez, I just can't understand what the occasion could be. Okay, the last sentence functioned as a spillover sentence, and as you can see, the target sentence did not appear in final position. Well, the metaphorically biasing context read as follows. In 1 second, the whole room fell silent. People dragged their feet and didn't dare lift their eyes off the floor. It was obvious that the recent news had totally shocked them. Ilan, though, was not going to let this party go down the drain. He jumped on the table and shouted, "Hey guys, what's with the long faces? This is not Memorial Day. Geez, I just can't understand what's gotten into you." Okay, even though the context sounded nice to us, we had, of course, to control for the bias. So 20 participants rated the degree of non-literality of the interpretation of the target sentences in their respective context on a 7-point non-literality scale. Sorry. Such is life. And results showed that negative items embedded in metaphorically biasing context were rated as more metaphoric than their affirmative counterparts, which were embedded in the literally biasing context. So we just established that the context was strongly biasing into the desirable directions. Okay, remember you have the same utterance embedded in either a metaphorically biasing context or a literally biasing context, and we wanted to make sure that the context that we constructed are really biasing in the right direction. Okay, so now we ran the reading experiment, and results show that metaphorically biased targets were read faster than the literal counterparts. No spillover effects were visible. Okay, so these 4 experiments actually presented items that met all the conditions for a novel non-literal interpretations that can be derived by default. And indeed, they show, and this is an interim summary, they show that negative statements were first rated as more metaphoric than their affirmative counterparts, even when novel. And in experiment 4, they showed that novel negatives were read faster in metaphorically than in literally biasing context. Okay, so now let's step outside the lab and see how people use, such items in natural uses, in, valid ecology. Okay, so this part of the talk is divided into 2. Basically, it's a corpus-based, the studies are corpus-based or corpus-assisted. And the first part will talk about or will report results relating to distribution of metaphoric and literal interpretations. And the second part will study the environment of such utterances and see whether they reflect or resonate with the literal or the metaphoric interpretations of the utterances. So now we are looking at these utterances in their natural context. So the first part, as I've said, will deal with the distribution of the metaphoric and the literal interpretations. And we will predict, as before, that natural uses of negative statements will be more metaphoric than their affirmative counterparts. Okay, what did we do? We searched the first more or less 50 occurrences of targets in both their affirmative and negative versions using engines such as Google, Yahoo, Start, MSN, Walla, which allows you to look at Hebrew usages, and NetX. And let's begin with the English data. Well, we hardly looked at Hebrew utterances because the Hebrew utterances were tested in the lab, so we just wanted to see how other languages fare with regard to non-literality and negation. So in English, well, the statement, I'm not your secretary.